The rural hills of California in 1984 were places where people believed bad things did not happen. Familiar roads, familiar houses, and a life that moved slowly and peacefully. There, the three Bennett sisters grew up believing they were safe. One evening, they left home for a very short drive. No one argued. No one worried. But they never came back. The car was found. Their belongings were still there. Only silence remained. And 12 years later, a chilling truth emerged: one of the three was still alive. Some disappearances are immediately terrifying. Because there are screams. Because there is chaos. Because something has clearly gone wrong. But the case of the three Bennett sisters was frightening in a different way. It was too quiet. Too clean. Their car was found along a familiar stretch of road. It hadn't gone off a cliff. There was no violent crash. It was tilted slightly, as if they had pulled over just for a moment. The doors were unlocked. The keys were missing. Inside were belongings no one would leave behind if they had walked away willingly. The purses were still there. A jacket was draped over the back seat. A cassette tape was stuck halfway, as if it had been stopped in the middle of a song. There was no blood. No broken glass. No clear signs of a struggle. And that was what made it truly chilling, because people do not leave a car like this. Three people do not step out of a car at the same time, leaving behind everything important, without a reason strong enough to force them. The question was no longer where they went, but what made them leave. Was it an offer that sounded completely ordinary? A kind of help that seemed harmless? Or a moment when they failed to realize that danger was standing right in front of them? In peaceful places, people grow used to believing they will have time to avoid it. But sometimes, danger does not arrive with chaos. It arrives quietly. And when you realize it, it is already too late. I want to ask you one small question. If you were standing in front of that car, what do you think happened? You can leave your thoughts in the comments. You are listening to this story with Living in Prayer, a place where silent things are told again, slowly and with deep compassion. In 1984, the small towns in the hills of California lived at a very different pace. Unhurried, unloud, days passed with sunlight, with routine, with things repeated long enough that people believed they would always be there. In the mornings, people greeted one another by name. In the afternoons, cars moved slowly along narrow roads, familiar with every bend. In the evenings, lights inside the houses came on early, as if to signal that it was time to come home. In places like these, strangers were easy to notice. An unfamiliar car. A face no one had seen before. It only took something slightly out of place to draw attention. That was why people believed danger belonged somewhere else in the cities. On the evening news, about unfamiliar names read aloud and quickly forgotten. Not here. Not on the road you walk every day. That belief was not naive. It was built on years of peace, on evenings when doors were left unlocked, on the feeling that if something happened, someone would hear. People grew up within that sense of safety. They learned to trust others, to believe that kindness was the default, that if they ran into trouble on the road, someone would stop to help. And because of that, very few were prepared for the opposite. No one thought that some dangers require no noise at all. No one taught them how to recognize threat when it appears in a perfectly ordinary form. Those hills were so quiet that when something bad truly happened, it didn't explode. It simply slipped in quietly, into a world that had grown too accustomed to safety. The Bennett sisters were not extraordinary in the way stories usually describe. They didn't stand out. They weren't loud. They were simply three very ordinary lives, bound together by the small things of everyday life. Laura was the eldest, 24 years old. At an age when many were still finding their way, Laura had grown accustomed to responsibility. She worked steadily, paid the rent on time, kept track of what needed worrying about so others wouldn't have to. Laura rarely spoke about her own exhaustion. She was the kind of person who believed that if she stayed strong, the family would be okay. But beneath that calm exterior was someone constantly holding herself together to keep everything from falling apart. Laura's anxiety was usually quiet. Emily was the middle sister. 21. She wasn't talkative, but she noticed everything. Emily caught the smallest changes, of voice growing softer, a sigh lingering a little too long. She heard the things that were never said. She lived gently, avoided conflict, never needed to be at the center. She was like a pause within the house, a place where others could sit down without needing to explain themselves. Sarah was the youngest. 18. 18 carried a different kind of energy, a sense that the world was wide, and she hadn't gone anywhere yet. Sarah wanted more than the roads around their town. She wanted farther journeys. She wanted the feeling of choosing her own life. She wasn't rebelling against her family. She was simply standing at the fragile edge between staying and stepping out, the delicate boundary of youth. The sisters didn't always show affection. They didn't hug every day. They didn't speak in long declarations of love. Their bond lived in habit, in shared meals without planning, in borrowing each other's clothes without asking, in conversations paused and picked up days later, as if they had never stopped. They were so used to having one another that they never imagined it could disappear, and when that familiarity was suddenly cut away, it left a space no one in the family could ever fill. That evening showed no warning signs, no arguments, no resentment, no harsh words. Just a very small decision to drive out for a bit before it got fully dark. A familiar trip, along roads they had traveled countless times before. Laura was driving. She drove the way she lived, careful and steady. Emily sat in the front passenger seat, looking out the window, quiet as usual. Sarah sat in the back, opening the cassette case, flipping through a few tapes, choosing what song would play next. There was music in the car. Not too loud. Just enough to fill the comfortable silence between people who knew each other well. Maybe they talked about small things. About a long workday. About a plan that wasn't fully formed yet. Or maybe they simply sat there together, not needing to say anything at all. If they had returned home that night, this would have been a faint memory. One that, years later, no one could quite recall. No one would remember which song was playing. No one would remember exactly what was said. Only the feeling of safety that came from being together. But they didn't come back. And when an ordinary trip has no ending, every detail suddenly becomes painfully important. People begin asking questions that will never have answers. Which tape did Sarah choose? Where did the song stop? Did Laura glance at the clock before turning? Did Emily say something no one had time to hear? That night, there was no moment of farewell. No one knew this would be the last time they shared such a small space together. It is that very normalcy that becomes the wound. Because it reminds those left behind that life can change direction in moments that seem entirely unremarkable. Not when tragedy arrives loudly, but when everything feels most at ease. The car was found the next day, along a familiar rural road. Not far from home. Not so remote that it was hard to reach. It sat there, slightly tilted to one side, as if it had pulled over only for a moment. There were no signs of a major collision. No skid marks. No indication it had left the road. The doors were unlocked. The keys were nowhere to be found. Inside, everything remained. Purses in their usual places. A jacket draped across the back seat, as if its owner had stepped away for only a few minutes. On the dashboard, the cassette tape was jammed halfway. Not fully inside. Not removed either. As though someone had touched it then stopped mid-motion. There was no blood. No shattered glass. No clear signs that a struggle had taken place. And it was precisely this absence that unsettled the first people on the scene. Because instinct said something had happened, it just hadn't been loud. People do not leave a car this way. One person might rush. Two people might panic. But three people, at the same time, leaving behind everything essential, is unlikely without a force strong enough to compel them. The car looked too neat, too orderly, too much like a moment frozen in time. For those accustomed to life in the quiet hills, the image created a feeling that was hard to name. Not immediate fear, but a slow cold spreading through the chest. Because when everything is too clean, people begin to understand that whatever intervened that night was not chaos. It was control. The search began quickly, then spread farther than anyone expected. Within hours, news of the three sisters' disappearance had traveled through the small town. People left their work unfinished, set meals aside. They came because they thought that if it were someone they loved, they would want others to search too. Volunteers arrived from everywhere. Familiar faces, people known only by name from morning greetings. They lined up, moving slowly through dry brush, calling out each name. Laura, Emily, Sarah. The calls echoed, then dissolved into the wind. There was no answer. Helicopters flew low over the hills. The blades churned dust and dry leaves, making the ground tremble. From above, everything looked small and frighteningly empty. Search dogs were brought in. They sniffed the ground, circled the car, then split off. But the wind on the hills shifted constantly. The ground was dry. Scent faded quickly. There is a critical moment in every search. It's when the dog slows down. Not because it has found something, but because there is nothing left to follow. There were no witnesses. No one remembered seeing the sisters on the road. No one heard screams in the night. Nearby houses had closed their doors early that evening. In the hills, night falls fast and quietly. People are used to sleeping early, used to believing there is no reason to stay awake and listen. Sound doesn't travel far here. Trees, slopes, and open spaces swallow it whole. And when sound disappears, everything else seems to disappear with it. Day turned into night. Night into day. Footsteps continued, but hope grew thinner. The longer they searched, the clearer one frightening truth became. Not that something had been missed, but that there might be nothing to find at all. The hills remained. Silent. Indifferent. As if they had witnessed everything and chosen not to speak. When there are no traces, people are forced to search for answers another way. Through theories. Through speculation. Through attempts to fill the silence. The first theory was that the sisters left voluntarily. 3 adults. No clear signs of force. Perhaps they wanted to start a different life. But that theory quickly weakened. Laura was responsible. She wouldn't disappear without leaving a message. Emily was attached to her routines. She wouldn't leave without telling someone. Sarah dreamed of more, but not of cutting all ties. And if they had truly left, they would have taken more with them. Money, documents, clothes, but their accounts were untouched. No letters, no signs of preparation. The second theory was an accident. The hills at night can be dangerous. A blind curve, one wrong step. But the searches found nothing to support it. No skid marks, no broken guardrails, no evidence the car ever left the road. Accidents leave traces. Here, there were none. Another theory suggested they accepted help from the wrong person. An unfamiliar car. An offer that sounded ordinary. A moment of trust consistent with how people lived here. It sounded plausible. But it still had gaps. Because 3 people don't leave a car together, without their belongings, without signs of panic, unless the person they faced made them believe there was nothing to fear. Police circled the same questions. They asked neighbors, friends, about unfamiliar vehicles. All roads led to the same place. No one remembered anything clearly enough. No one saw the decisive moment. Every theory made sense until examined closely. And when examined closely, none were enough. The feeling among investigators wasn't immediate deadlock. It was a quiet dread. That what happened might not have been a mistake, but something carefully planned. And that thought made the case more frightening than any theory before it. Time did not stop, even if the questions did. After months of hope and waiting, the case shifted into another state. Police called it a cold case. For investigators, it meant fewer leads, fewer calls, fewer things to hold on to. For the Bennett family, it had no such name, It was simply absence extended long enough to become part of life. At first, porch lights stayed on late, as if the sisters were only coming home late, as if the light could guide them back. Years passed. Birthdays came. 3 cakes were never placed together again. The names were still spoken, but more softly, more carefully, as if saying them too loudly might hurt more. Holidays became awkward. No one knew how many places to set at the table. Some seats remained empty, and no one dared to fill them. The house grew quiet in a strange way. Bedrooms remained. Clothes still hung where they always had. Small objects once unnoticed became proof that the sisters had existed. The family lived with a very particular kind of loss. No funeral. No goodbye. Only a question that stretched year after year. Some chose hope. Hope became a way to breathe. They believed the sisters were alive somewhere, that waiting a little longer might be enough. Others couldn't live in suspension. They prepared for the worst not because they wanted to let go, but because shapeless pain was unbearable. That difference slowly fractured the family. Not from blame but from carrying grief in different ways. 12 years passed quietly. No turning point. Only exhaustion. And through it all, the deepest pain wasn't believing the sisters were gone, it was not knowing how to grieve. Because without answers, grief never ends. It only learns to stay quietly in every corner of the house. In the spring of 1996, at an emergency room in California, an unidentified patient was brought in at night. No documents. No family. Only a thin, exhausted body. She didn't look homeless. Her clothes were old, but not street dirty, worn down by time, by being worn too long, for too many years. Nurses quickly noticed something was wrong. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, bruises layered over one another, old and new, as if injuries never had time to heal. Her hands trembled even while resting, not from cold but from a body trained to remain alert. When asked her name, she stayed silent for a long time. Not because she didn't know, but as if she were deciding whether it was safe to say. Finally, she spoke softly, almost a whisper. "Sarah Bennett." The room changed. A nurse paused. A quick exchange of looks. Someone stepped away to make a call. No one told her anything yet. Vitals were taken, fluids administered, notes written. But something had shifted. Fingerprints were taken, records compared. And when confirmation returned, it was checked again just to be sure. The woman before them was not just an unidentified patient. She was Sarah Bennett, the youngest sister, missing for 12 years. When told her identity was confirmed, Sarah didn't cry, didn't sigh with relief. What appeared on her face was fear. Deep, familiar. Her first question wasn't about her family. It was whether anyone else knew she was there. In that moment, they understood something crucial. Sarah wasn't simply someone who had returned. She was someone who had survived by staying silent. And that silence had kept her alive for 12 long years. In the days that followed, police didn't rush to question Sarah. They understood that some stories cannot be pulled out. They surface only when the teller feels safe enough to breathe. When Sarah began to speak, the story wasn't linear. It came in fragments. Images, sounds, sensations clear, but out of order. Sometimes she stopped for long moments. Eyes lowered, as if returning to a place she had tried to forget. She spoke of the night in 1984. The moment the car stopped. The sudden appearance of strangers. There was no immediate panic, no screaming. Everything happened calmly. Too calmly. That calmness told her something. This wasn't an accident. Not an impulsive act. They knew what they were doing. They spoke with order. Roles were assigned, someone commanded. Someone watched. Sarah didn't call it a kidnapping. She said it felt rehearsed. Time afterward blurred. Day and night merged. No calendar. No markers. She learned to observe to survive. To memorize small details. Patterns. Rare moments of carelessness. She didn't describe everything that happened. Not because she forgot, because those memories were never safe to touch for long. When asked why she stayed silent for 12 years, Sarah answered slowly. Silence was survival. She believed those responsible hadn't vanished. They were still somewhere. Still remembered. Still capable of returning. She feared that if she went back to her family they would be seen. And if seen, everything could happen again. So she disappeared again. Not to forget, but to protect the people she loved in the only way she knew. For 12 years, Sarah didn't live freely. She lived like a shadow. And as she spoke, those listening understood her silence wasn't escape. It was the cost of survival. And the truth she carried was not random tragedy, but evidence of something carefully organized. Once Sarah's testimony was recorded, the case changed shape. For the first time in 12 years, it no longer centered on absence but on survival. Investigators returned to old files. Yellowed pages. Notes once dismissed. Details once scattered were now placed beside Sarah's account. An unfamiliar vehicle mentioned years ago. A remote property once suspected but never thoroughly searched. A group moving between counties leaving little trace. Together, the pieces began to fit. Searches expanded beyond the hills. To other places. Same time. Same type of disappearance. Cases once thought unrelated emerged. Abandoned cars. Too orderly. A pattern formed, not a lone offender but a group. They chose locations, timing, victims. Arrests were quiet. No sirens. No cameras. Interrogations began in silence. The suspects believed time had erased everything. Until one of them faltered. Not from remorse but fear. Faced with new evidence and a survivor's testimony, silence was no longer safe. He spoke not to confess everything, but to save himself. It was enough. The Bennett sisters' disappearance was not isolated. It was part of a series hidden for years. And Sarah's return didn't just reopen a case. It awakened what time had tried to bury. The final search wasn't rushed. No one wanted to be wrong. Sites mentioned in testimony were revisited. Remote land. Places that looked like countless others. Forensic teams worked quietly. Layer by layer. No dramatic moment. No cries. Just weight settling over those present. When the truth emerged, no words were needed. Laura and Emily were not coming home. After 12 years suspended between hope and fear, the final question had an answer but not relief. The family was told privately. No cameras. Only those who had waited too long. No one cried at first. Some pain doesn't explode. Names once spoken daily were now spoken differently. Not waiting but confirmation. It was an ending. And a beginning. An end to shapeless hope. A beginning of named grief. Truth doesn't comfort. It only settles uncertainty. And sometimes, that certainty is the deepest pain of all. Justice was finally named. Those responsible were held accountable. But justice does not heal. It doesn't return lost years. Erase memory. Or remove fear from sleep. For Sarah, truth wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She started small. Learning to sleep without jolting awake. To trust daylight. To believe silence was no longer a threat. She carries Laura and Emily with her. Not as unanswered questions but as real people. The road where the car was found still exists. Cars pass every day. The wind still moves through the hills. Most people pass without knowing. But for those who do, it is a reminder sometimes the worst things don't arrive loudly. They come quietly. And leave echoes that last a very long time. If you've listened this far, I invite you to pause in silence. For Laura. For Emily. For Sarah. And for all who survived through silence. If this story touched you, you may leave an amen. And if you wish to continue with stories told slowly and deeply, stay with the channel.